Yes. All right, let's do the next. Well, let's leave this one on. I'm going to say a few words about this. So welcome back to class. Thanks for coming back. This I can hear that the voice is clearer, so that's already a plus. So last week we started out by talking about the overall outlook, the overall global economic outlook, and we talked about the fact that the outlook is positive but subdued in the sense that the growth projections are going slightly down globally, and we also talked about the fact that inflation is more controlled, at least in the advanced economies, and the fact that there's great concern and growing concern about fragmentation. And we talked a little bit about that, and I'll talk more about that today. And then I received from you some suggestions on topics that you wanted me to cover. And so today it's a little bit of a potpourri, because I'd like to address topics that interest you. And we'll get to that in a minute. One slide I didn't show you last time because I couldn't figure out where it was, is sort of the universe of international organizations and other organizations that I'm looking at when I talk about the global economic outlook. And I just discovered that when you look at the lower left-hand side, the IMF, for some reason, I took the German logo. Maybe my computer decided I should take the German logo. It should have said International Monetary Fund. Instead, it says Internationaler Währungsfonds. Just adds to the internationality here. So the IMF, on the upper three, we have the OECD. The OECD has approximately 40 members, all of the advanced economies, and some of the emerging market economies are members of the OECD. So it's a different perspective than the next one over, which is the World Bank. And again, the BIS is another smallish organization, mostly comprising central banks. Again, a smaller number of countries, mostly advanced economies. BIS also has a very narrow view. They're looking at banking, cryptocurrencies, inflation, anything having to do with financial sector stability. Then the International Monetary Fund, which is focused on the global economic perspective, but also looks at regional and country-by-country perspectives. The World Trade Organization is, as the name suggests, the organization that is very much focused on trade, and has a huge data collection, but also deals with any sorts of complaints and problems that arise in the arena of trade. Now I've lost the PowerPoint. But in addition, there are a number of, on the left-hand side there I was showing you a number of other agencies that play an important role and that we have to look at, in particular the regulatory agencies that play a role in the international arena. So that could be on a national level, it could be central banks, but oftentimes they're also more specialized agencies. Let's say in the US you have the controller of the currency, which is an agency that oversees certain financial institutions. You have the various stock exchanges, etc. So all of these. And then in addition, for the last 15 or 20 years, civil society has also been more active in participating in this process. And by civil society, I mean, a pretty broad group. There are people, who are working on food security, for example. And they may say, well, the IMF needs to pay more attention to that because that's really basic. There are other NGOs that are very focused on climate change issues. And again, they will look to the World Bank or to the IMF or to these other agencies and say, we need to be in contact and we need to talk to each other. And so over time, what has happened is this relationship used to be, pretty unpleasant, let's say. But there used to be demonstrations outside of the IMF, and saying all kinds of nasty things about what the IMF should or should not be doing. But over time, the dialogue has developed and evolved so that today, when you go to the annual meetings, for instance, you'll find a lot of activities that are put on jointly with civil society and the international organizations. So they have become, at the bottom there, an important player. All right. Let's go to the next slide, and please interrupt with questions or remarks or anything as we go along.
Okay. Now this is working.
Wonderful. So today, I know someone was asking about a little more on inflation, so I want to briefly talk about that. I know everyone is interested in China, so I'll say a few words about China and China's role. I want to go back to the question of fragmentation of trade. We already looked at a couple of slides, but I think it's interesting to go a little deeper. And finally, migration. The World Bank recently published a very comprehensive report about migration. So I'm going to use that as a springboard to talk about, what is currently the status and what are the kind of frameworks that people, particularly policymakers, are looking at to address migration-related issues. So the World Development Report is an annual report where it says migrants, refugees, societies. That's the report that was recently published that I'm using. And on the right-hand side, the Regional Economic Outlook. Last time I was looking at the World Economic Outlook, the WEO, which is published by the IMF twice a year. And then there are subcategories that deal with regional economic outlooks, and I'll refer to that. Also, last time I received a very good feedback, which was, my charts, and I have a gazillion charts, as you know, are too small and too busy. And, to some extent I can't control that, but I did make an effort to make them a bit clearer, bigger, and sacrificing sometimes the top line. I'll just tell you what the theme is if it's not self-evident. But let's see whether that succeeded. So we'll start with inflation. And here, the other thing I've been playing with is this draw button. You probably all know this one. I kind of think it's kind of fun, but you can also really ruin things. Yeah, sometimes you do something wrong and then you have it on every slide. So yeah, then you spend 3 hours trying to figure out what went wrong. Here is a great statistic. If you ever want to do these kinds of statistics, go to the OECD for all the advanced economies. They have a really nice setup there and everything that you can play with. Here I'm looking at the US inflation. And I think we all remember the timeline here. This is the early 1970s. This was the oil price shock. So this was a commodity shock. Suddenly prices went up, and no one was really prepared. I'm not sure how things were here in the US, but in Europe, there were huge changes, relocations. So, for example, no driving a car on Sundays, which, since I didn't have a driver's license, I thought that was rather fun because, it was like bicycles on the autobahn and things like that. But in the economic arena, it really influenced the price level generally because, at the end of the day, people are not that flexible. You need to get to work, and if you have to pay twice the price for the gas, well, that's what you have to do. And in the following years, it went even higher, peaking at something like 14%. And that is kind of a dynamic that sometimes develops. So prices start rising in one corner of the economy, and then people, who are working say, look, I need to get a pay raise because I'm experiencing a pay cut here effectively because the wage bundle that makes up my salary is shrinking. And so then there's sort of a catch-up game that starts, and inflation can become very much a self-fulfilling prophecy. And at that point, Paul Volcker was, the president of the Fed, and in those days, monetary policy really shifted its view from, letting things happen to saying we need to really influence expectations of inflation. We need to lay out a scenario that our society can look at and see, okay, we're aiming for stability of prices. Of course, we're also looking at employment, but, we will commit to a certain rate. So something called inflation targeting became the new policy framework that has since then been adopted by very many countries. So the US right now, you'll hear about the target, the inflation target of approximately 2%. But what is truly remarkable, comparing US with other countries in the world, and I'm thinking here not of the advanced economies, but the vast majority of countries, is that you have almost 30 years of price stability, virtually, because the difference between 4%, 3% is not something people notice that much. Also, you have to keep in mind that it's an aggregate number, and each person has a different price level, if you will. If you are, for instance, if you're a smoker, you'll be very much affected by the price of cigarettes. If you are a bicyclist, you will be looking at prices related to that, or if you are a race car driver, etc. And in fact, many statisticians offer a tool that says you can calculate your own CPI, your own inflation rate based on what you consume. So all of that just to say that when you are in this area where you have, sometimes 1% more, 1.5% more, that's price stability. And that's worked pretty well. Currently, of course, we know there's been another disturbance. There was the pandemic, the war, which increased, again, commodities prices, and a lot of emphasis in the policy debate on, anchoring expectations. And talking about what needs to be done, how it can be done to go back to the price stability. Now compare this picture, and you can't put those on the same one because the scale is so different. But compare this with Turkey. By the way, Turkey is now spelled differently from the way they spelled it 5 years ago, but that's how it's spelled. So the Turkish rate looks very different. So we see 12 years of relative stability, but that's at 10%. So, that's 2.5 times more than the US. That's already quite a bit more. Also, it's not 30 years. In 30 years, you have a whole generation that's grown up and never really heard of inflation before. So that's phenomenal. Here, it's a short time, for 12 years. And if you look before, you're looking at hyperinflation here, well over 100%, and very unstable. And this is the experience in most developing countries. So this is what the rest of the world is facing. And you can see in the last few years, Turkey's inflation rate has gone up. Once again, currently it's again at the hyperinflation level. So you can imagine that when you live in this sort of scenario, you have to be quite sophisticated about your finances in some ways. And the kind of things that people typically try to do, if they can, is to look for earnings, foreign exchange earnings. So whether it's engaging in trade or getting a job abroad or finding some ways invoicing in foreign currency, hard currencies. And so hard currencies, especially the US dollar and the euro, play a huge role in these countries. people also will try to have bank accounts in foreign banks in their own country. So Citibank in Istanbul, for example, will help people manage this difficult situation. But the vast majority of people would not be able to have foreign exchange accounts. So they will experience, much more of a day-to-day struggle in just planning their finances and, making sure that they don't fall into poverty. You can fall into poverty very quickly with hyperinflation if you don't, if you're not very active. And so that's kind of leads to a very different mindset. Unless there are other questions about inflation, yes. Oh.
So Argentina is going into a runoff election this Sunday,
Right.
and there are two candidates. One is socialist leaning, one is libertarian leaning. The libertarian is looking to whack the size of government and dollarize their economy. What are some of these large international organizations thinking they can do to help them solve this inflation rate, which is hovering right at 140%? It seems like neither side has got a solution.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and that is a lot of what the IMF, World Bank, and others try to do. To say, look, it's very important, for instance, on government spending. It's very important to develop a plan, let's say a 10-year plan, where you can persuade your citizens that you're not going to start spending excessively or start shrinking excessively, but kind of develop a path. And then you'll have to look at a lot of the building blocks of that, because you cannot just say, we'll adjust government spending. You'll have to explain what will that do, for instance, to health insurance. Is that going to be privatized, and then, or is that going to be cut? And all of the different components of government spending. And the IMF typically helps countries develop such programs, and then work with the policymakers to implement these programs. But of course, there are always surprises, and politics is something that's part of the sovereign nations, area, and IMF and international organizations will not get involved in political issues directly, indirectly perhaps, but so a lot of it, a lot of the work that the IMF is focused exactly on that. I also have to say that in very many instances, you're not necessarily the most welcome person when you come to these countries. They may invite you. In fact, the IMF never goes anywhere unless invited. Then when you show up and you have some suggestions on, where to cut government spending, for example, there are some countries that a third of their people are on the payroll of the government. Yeah, and then if you say, look, compare that to other, countries in your peer group, here are some that are doing pretty well, and here is approximately, the number of staff they have in there working in the government. Now, that kind of information is persuasive in theory, but it's not always welcome by the countries. So oftentimes you end up spending quite a bit of time just trying to persuade and hope that it's implemented. Yes.
Yes, I just have never understood why in countries like Turkey and, I experienced it in Greece as well.
Yes.
Where the wealthy class really put their money in Swiss banks. That's where they put it, and so everybody else has to live on what's left. How does that help the government? How does that help their own country? Doesn't that make it worse?
Yes, it makes it worse, and on the other hand, it's a reflection of not having confidence and trust in governments. But and in many countries, this kind of sending your money to Switzerland is not necessarily legal. But, if you are in this sort of situation and you do have the option, you kind of think about yourself and your family and your children, etc. And, the rational thing to do is to look for ways to save your money abroad. So, it's a very complex process, and Greece is a great example. Of course, Greece is in some ways the opposite example too, because that's not a country that's strong in enforcing tax rules, for example. So sometimes these countries become tax havens. Two more. Oh.
The bottom line, I assume, is the US?
And OECD countries. Yeah.
OECD,
So,
it's the average.
it's the average OECD countries, mostly advanced economies.
And countries who dollarize in order to get away from inflation. What effect does that have on the economy?
Well,
Does it really stabilize it? Or?
no, it does not. I mean, it was very fashionable, I'm going to say in the 20 teens.
Yeah.
And there are some Panama, for instance, that are fully dollarized. And there are many countries that are not officially dollarized, but where the dollar will get you anything.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the flip side. That's the cost of running a very inefficient government. But the disadvantage is that you cannot control the dollars. Usually a country that has its own currency can print the currency, can manage the currency. But if you have a foreign currency in your own country, you cannot manage that currency because it's not your currency.
Isn't that the advantage of it? I mean, isn't that the advantage of dollarizing for them? Because they aren't managing their own currency.
Right.
And so if the economy works on the dollar, it's not good for the U.S., but it certainly seems to get out of the trap of having lost confidence in the currency. They just go to a currency that they do have confidence in, and the economy can continue working because the confidence is there.
Is that analogous to the euro? With Portugal and Greece having all of their inflationary overspending issues in the last decade or so?
Well, it's not. The euro is a currency that was adopted by all of the euro area countries. So that's quite different because the ECB, the European Central Bank, controls that currency. It sounds like it could work, but you can think of it this way: where do these dollars come from? Right? You can. If you want to run your day-to-day,
So there's
small
just not
farm.
enough money? Is that?
If you think about the actual dollars in circulation in the US relative to the totality of payments that are going on, it's a very small amount because most of the payments are in the virtual space with credit cards, etc.
Right.
But if you wanted to clone that system in a country that does not have the dollar, then you'll basically be running, either you run two different systems, or you are very dependent on the sources of the dollar, which is basically trade. But, the international trade. But most of your economy is not international trade. Most of your economy is domestic stuff. So sometimes what happens is you have a very skewed economy where you have a lot of barter going on, which is super inefficient, and then you have kind of a small subset of the economy that's in dollars. So in practice, it has not worked very well, but there are many countries that have kind of a sub-currency, for those who can afford.
And if a country wants to tie its currency to the dollar, that's very expensive for them, right?
It can be. Fixed exchange rates, were very fashionable in the 1970s. In fact, the entire global system was based, after World War II, was based on more or less fixed exchange rates. But it's like, different cars driving at different speeds. You can't tie them together. Sometimes it works, if they all agree. But then if one country develops more quickly or, falls behind, then the fixed exchange rate becomes a very costly.
Yes, and I believe that it would be very difficult to, the short-term risks of dollarization are that people are in poverty in countries like Argentina already, 60% or so, and they're getting paid in their old pesos, and the conversion rate back to dollars would be absolutely minuscule. The money changers make money on that transaction, but the people are losers.
Yeah. Okay, let me move on. China. Okay, so remember we started out saying 3% and 2.8% are the forecasts, and Asia and Pacific will remain the most dynamic region, with growth expected to rise from 3.9% last year to 4.6% in 2023. So that's the opposite direction. China and India are projected to contribute jointly about half of world growth in both 2023 and 2024. So very major players in the world economy in terms of economic growth. And conversely, if there's an issue, then it'll pull everybody down. So here is another picture of how the relativities have changed over the past decade. So 1990s on the left-hand side. I put the US in big green color, and you can see that in 1990, the weight of global GDP of the US was about 25%. Went up a little bit, but it didn't change that much. The last shaded area is expected developments in the next few years. China is in purple. You can see that it started in 1990 as a really pretty small player, but it has gone up and it's now approximately at the level of 20%. The euro area started at 25%, it's slowly gotten down to somewhere around 15%. Now, when I look at charts like that, which are all based on official statistics, with my experience of how these data are sometimes put together, I am not completely convinced that that purple line is a true representation of what is going on. It looks a little bit too perfect. And, we know that there are some countries, for instance, the former East Germany was a good example of that the statisticians were told, growth is in our plan is such and such, 5% this year. And then the government wasn't happy if the statisticians said, oh, by the way, we are not meeting that target. And so, the incentives that statisticians had to deviate from the planned numbers was not strong, was actually quite adverse. And then you get these very beautifully smooth growth rates. And no one, based on official statistics, there was in no way one could have predicted that people were quite unhappy there, that economic growth was not what it seemed to be, and that all of a sudden, it collapsed in 1989, 1990. I don't think this is quite the same as China. Yes.
Can we make any kind of guess how inflated that is in China? I mean, we have an idea of where it really is closer to?
There are several studies. We did a big study at the INET just before I left to look at some of the methodologies that are used in China, and came to the conclusion that this could be lower by at least 1 point over time, but it also is probably not as smooth. So now, one reason why this sort of calculation is important is I mentioned last time that IMF and World Bank the governance structure of those two reflects the relative economic size and not the principle of one country, one vote. And so every few years, the relativities are recalculated in a pretty elaborate process. And then there are always those who say, oh, why don't we just use GDP? Make it simple, you know. And you can imagine who's voting in favor of that. And then we'll see, okay, China should now have, 20% of the votes. In fact, what has happened in the past, a much more complex set of calculations was proposed and used because the IMF's and World Bank's focus is really the global stability. And so the argument is, if you're looking at global stability, we should look at trade, world trade, because that's, the global part of your economy. A lot of your economy can be very inward-looking, but what we are, managing here is the stability on the global level. So let's bring in another statistic, which is the world trade proportions and the relative size in terms of world trade. And you can see there that the euro area is a very big player in terms of trade. So the left hand, the dark blue is 1997, the light blue is 2023. The euro area is by far the biggest player. The United States is also very significant. And China is much smaller in terms of trade. A lot of the Chinese economy is because it's a huge economy, inward-looking economy. So we can see in terms of growth, yes, it's expanding, but on the international trade arena, it's not as big a play. That was another question. Yeah.
The absolute number for China of their GDP in those years where percent growth shows rapid increase, like 2010, 2020, is there confidence in the absolute number?
The absolute number and the growth rate are the same. I mean, the same origin and the same confidence, I would say. Not really. I mean, you always have to make some adjustments. You have to put this in US dollars, etc. So there are all kinds of errors that could occur, or there could be, slight misrepresentation. But what I'm commenting on is really this, this path. It's, all of a sudden you see, a steady growth, and it looks so much like a planned, a plan rather than what's actually happening. But you cannot, because it's a very complex number, there's no way you can really recalculate it. You can simply look at all the different components that make up GDP to see whether this makes sense. And trade is one of them. Like consumption, investment, government spending, and trade.
Wouldn't you expect that growth would be higher if a country gets its act together? The growth would be much higher in countries that start from a much lower base.
Yes.
So that as China gets more and more higher, you would expect more leveling off, just the way the United States has also. The curious thing about it there is the Europe. Why is Europe declining? Or is it not declining? It's just percentage.
It's just relative.
Yes,
because there's also the rest of the world that's not on here.
Right.
So the Brazils, the Gulf countries, all of those have expanded in relative size.
Right. So the GDP is probably level or increasing in Europe, but because the others are increasing more, that's why the percentage is going up.
Yeah. Okay. But at the moment, these quotas, so also the quota review is ongoing, and I mentioned the US has approximately 16% of the total votes. Japan has something like 6%, and China is still 2 or 3%. So there will be some realignment of the relative votes in the coming this year, perhaps, and then in the future as well. Now we've seen that in terms of real estate, there's been a lot of mentioned discussion about issues and problems and bankruptcies of real estate companies. So in general, a different analysis of what's happening in China recently in the last 2 years, which is not exactly consistent with the previous slide, suggests that real investment has been going down. Housing starts are going down, and sales are also going down, recovering a little bit towards the last point there. But in general, this is all below zero, so this is all negative. And then the question is, if China loses momentum or growth starts to slow down, how does that affect everyone else? And that's where my previous slide was speaking to it, that China and India both are very much influencing the performance of the global economy. Here's another statistic that you've probably heard a lot about, in part because the Statistics Office of China no longer publishes these data. But the top line is the one I want to draw your attention to. That's the urban unemployment rate of young people between the ages of 16 and 24. And that's at around 20%. And this is, of course, something that the Chinese leadership is very worried about, because that is, a potential of unrest, of unhappiness, and expressed in various ways. Of course, this is very difficult in China, but any countries that have this sort of issue with young people not being employed are usually in for a rough time at some point.
How do those numbers reflect kids who are in college now? Doesn't China have?
Well, I mean, there is a definition of unemployment. If you're in college, then you're not unemployed.
Okay.
So, but these are the kind of numbers that for the US will look very different. There are some countries like Spain where it looks this way too, but in Spain it's been this way for a very long time, so it doesn't have that kind of, potential for political unrest and unhappiness.
What are some of the reasons for that? Maybe everyone else in the room knows, but
I'm not sure what the reasons are, quite frankly. It could just reflect the changes in the economy, that growth is slowing down considerably, and everybody who already has a job keeps the job, and there's young folks coming in, finding it difficult to be accepted. That's one option, but I'm not sure what the reason is. This is one of the challenges with China. We have, a lot of guessing going on.
One of the things we know that comes through the Department of Defense that they're very concerned with is that for every engineer that we undergraduate that we create in the United States, they create 40 in China. And so with a lot of the manufacturing starting to slow down in China, there's no place for those engineers to go other than internationally go somewhere else. But everything I've read, this is a real problem. Xi in the last Congress said that the members need to become stronger and better Marxists. Otherwise, he's worried about some revolutionary thought.
Yeah. So the downside scenario, if there is such a thing as a housing market correction in China, which would trigger stress in the financial sector and the banking sector, for property developers, more generally asset quality deterioration, because typically a lot of money is tied up in or invested in real estate, China's GDP could decline by as much as 1.6%, and then world GDP would decline as well by about 0.6%. Yes.
The interesting thing about that, though, is that world GDP would decline by 0.6, but isn't a lot of that 0.6 because of China? I mean, because of China, if you subtract it from the thing, the rest of the world could be going along the same, but because China isn't pushing it up.
Well, because China is, if you can think of it this way, China is buying a lot of things in the market.
They are.
Right? And if they buy much less, because,
Yeah.
then this is how the transmission works.
Yeah. I guess, yeah.
And that's, all of these kind of statements are based on big models that look at these relationships over time. And, 30 years ago, China's economy bettered pretty little, precious little for the rest of the world. But because of this relative size and growing size, it does make a difference. And that's, what our models will show. But, a simple way to think of it is simply that they will not be buying as much from the rest of us, from the rest of the countries, than they would otherwise.
The other interesting thing about China's real estate market, this is what happened in Japan in the 70s. And it has taken, 50 years really to recover from that. And so China is not looking, if that's the same overvaluation and therefore
Overvalued, and the vacancy rates are just
outrageous, yeah. My mind, entire cities that are just.
Yeah, and you don't have to go so far. We have that same problem in the US sometimes, and
Yeah.
right? I also think the analogy of Japan is quite interesting because if you think back, Japan in the 70s looked like it was going to buy all of the West, remember? And real estate was a major way in which they could, just make themselves at home here. And people were quite worried about it because you just assume, okay, it's going this way, it'll just continue. And it didn't.
China is doing that.
Who's afraid of Japan nowadays? Even though Japan is so present, just think of all the automobile manufacturing. But, there's been a learning process that no one feels threatened by it. On the contrary, it's good because you have, more choices. And, it's just as American made as, American cars. I think we all know what that was like in the 70s. It was kind of scary. And right now we see something very similar with Japan, with China, except that China is so much bigger that we, say, hey, this could really, take over the whole world economy. But, this linear development is just not how the world works. So,
You made a comment last time you were talking about the wealthy investing. I'm not talking about the country's investments, but the wealthy. Are the wealthy of Chinese investing at home, or are they investing elsewhere? As you called it a safe haven, the U.S. dollar said a safe haven.
When I said safe haven, I'm talking about cash money. Right. So investing, portfolio investments, bank accounts, and things like that. The bulk of the investment in industry, etc., and in real estate is domestic in China.
It is.
Yes, by a long shot. And one reason is that, it's very difficult to take money abroad.
So is it the government, Chinese government is buying so much of our farmland and all of that?
Yeah.
So it's the government.
That's there's also individuals, but the government is definitely part of that story.
That's a little scary.
Yeah, it's scary. But Japan was also scary because they were doing exactly the same thing. Yes.
I'd be interested in your comment on a pundit's statement of China. A characteristic of their economy that differentiates them from the U.S. in particular is they do not have a large consumer component to their GDP, to their growth. And the United States supposedly has done so well through this turbulent economic time because our consumers still go out and eat, travel, buy durable goods, etc. Though China has lifted a huge number of people out of poverty, they don't really have a leisure industry, a hospitality industry. And that in part explains why a 20-year-old in China is unemployed. You know, there are not as many entry options. Is that true?
Could be. I am not an expert on China, I have to say so. But, you know, consumption certainly has become a focus in China. And, you know, we look at the huge urban areas, because that, you know, represents consumption. You know, the details are probably quite different from the composition of consumption is probably quite different from the US, but I'm not an expert on China. Shall we move on to, or is there another question? Okay. So trade fragmentation. So this is this, you know, new concern, or it's not that new, but it is an increasing concern that the world is not globalizing, but that the world is kind of falling apart. So here is a picture that kind of divides the last 150 years into some big chunks. So, for instance, if we start on the left-hand side, so industrialization, total trade relative to GDP was around 30% already. It's pretty high, so it's quite a bit of integration. In the interwar era, it dove down, shrank enormously. And then the era after 1945 and the following years is really, it's called the Bretton Woods era, because that was when the IMF and the World Bank were formed, and, you know, a very deliberate effort was made to bring the world closer together, to foster trade and integration, which worked pretty well. As you can see, we're getting back to 30% of GDP approximately. And then the era of globalization, where, you know, every country is pulled into the world market and trade becomes you know, a really major force of global economic dynamics. So now the concern is that the present situation is, they call it globalization. It's like slowing down the globalization. But in addition, there's a great concern that the world, rather than coming closer together, is going to fall apart into different geopolitical camps. Further down, we have some information on primary goods and primary goods excluding fuels, but I don't think that's that crucial part of the story here. I'm stuck. You're stuck? Okay. Can't advance it. Something's messing around. Okay. So in one of these publications of the IMF, we see actually spelling out who's in which camp. So here's the China-Russia bloc. Includes, of course, China, Hong Kong, India, Iran, Kazakhstan. I just underlined some of the bigger countries: Pakistan, Russia, South Africa, and then a bunch of other countries. So that would be the one bloc. And the war in Ukraine is kind of an area, at a point in time when this becomes quite clear all of a sudden. And here is a picture. So don't look at the details. This is I call it a visual, just so that you have, you know, you can see. So the US-EU bloc is, you know, 2.5 times as many countries than the China-Russia bloc, but of course the composition also matters. But I thought this was a kind of a fun way of showing the new Cold War, the new kind of division. I know all of you like to travel, so I'm going to keep a larger version of that in your pocket. Yes.
Vietnam is an interesting Yeah,
Hungary too.
yeah.
Yeah,
because-
Vietnam is over there.
Yeah, it's
It
over
could be
there.
over here, yeah, you would think.
Yeah, well, because it is trying to position itself as a alternative to China manufacturing.
Yes.
So that they're trying to get as much of it out of China into Vietnam as they can.
Yeah.
And so far very successful.
Yeah.
That's part of the decline of China manufacturing. The countries like Vietnam are really trying to say we can undercut them. We can do just as good as job and technology. So that's even with that smaller list, it's not really all that stable. Plus Russia is destabilized itself.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I think there are any number of countries where, it could be going either way. Because some of the trade is not very deep. For instance, certain industries like textile, they're very mobile. They may be a huge part of Vietnamese economy today, 5 years from now, Bangladesh, Egypt.
Interesting that Zimbabwe is up there. Zimbabwe uses exclusively US dollar.
I mean, I don't know if I still kept this one slide, but somebody, I think you asked last time about the use of the US dollar in commodities trades. And, it's everywhere. So, most of the commodities are quoted and traded in US dollars. But yeah, I mean, this is kind of an interesting juxtaposition of, who might be on one side. I suspect in putting this together, trade patterns were one criterion, and politics another. And Vietnam, politically, Vietnam is certainly, more in that camp than in terms of the political system than this camp. You can think of all these discussions about democracy, which, by the way, you're at the IMF. The word democracy does not enter into any of the official documentations because the IMF, interestingly, I mean, you would think since it was formed after World War II, with the US being a very important driving force, the UK as well, that democracy might be put in there as a goal, but it's not. So very different from EU, of course. EU is all about bringing together democracies.
Stability-wise, is there enough equal volatility on both sides? I mean, I realize there's a lot more nations on the US and the Euro bloc.
Yeah.
But then you look how many countries are in the Euro, so or that section, so that takes a lot of.
Yeah, 20 or so. Yeah,
So it
not
takes
too many. Yeah.
But is either bloc more stable in terms of their relationships than the other? Or is it all just?
I mean, this is a question for a political scientist. And it's very difficult. I'll show you what the IMF does with these numbers. A political scientist might say, well, I mean, China, for instance, and Russia don't believe that democracies have a future. And they will have all kinds of examples, including some recent ones in the US, to say, well, democracies are very, unstable. The view here is the opposite. And, I mean, I believe that democracies are, in the long run, the most stable system. Now, in terms of economics, and the reason why this came up is because the IMF was looking at commodities trade and the fragmentation of trade, and being concerned that if trade starts to fall apart or become political, that hurts everybody in the long run. I mean, that's where the example of the oil price shock came in. It was a very political context. So next slide, please.
Yeah, I would argue Morocco is probably closer ally than some of the other ones. I would put Morocco more in the U.S. bloc.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I mean, there's a whole bunch of different criteria that were used. And Morocco, I agree with you. I think Morocco is probably a question of where you would put it. So last time we looked at trade, and we looked at a statistic that said, in terms of trade, commodities trade, much is dominated by the 3 largest producers. And when we left it at that. So here we have some examples. Oh, wait a minute, where is the let's go forward a couple of slides first. I don't see. Okay, so here's another visual. Yeah, don't worry about reading this part here because this is just all the different products. The blue lines here indicate that the vast majority of this product, let's say palm oil in this case, is produced by the US, Europe, and those who are leaning towards US and Europe. So that part is all in blue. And those who are leaning to China and Russia, so that other bloc, produces significant portions of these items. Okay, so for example, if we look at rare earth, which is here, the majority, something like 80%, comes from 2 countries, and they're both in the other camp, if you will. Whereas soybeans, I assume this is the US, but soybeans are 80% coming from the US, Europe, and bloc. So if you, without studying this into great detail, there are some that are in the middle. Sugar, for instance, is 50-50, so won't fight over the sugar. But copper is up here. Like I said, rare earth is down here. Tobacco is somewhere there. And then, you have to think about what is the strategic importance of each of those. But, we're not going to go there right now. But there are people, of course, who are very well aware. So, but that is sort of the current situation that, in terms of commodity capabilities, if you will. And what happens if trade doesn't take place according, to supply and demand, but if trade starts being a political thing, well, I'm not going to sell you my sugar, I'm not going to sell you my rare earth because I know you would be, using this to build, whatever, supercomputers. If that happens, then the world economy can become very inefficient because all of a sudden everybody is going to start thinking of substituting items that cannot get easily or not reliably. And this is what the concern is, that all of a sudden trade becomes very politicized and very inefficient. Let me see, for some reason the details don't show up. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, but isn't it a fun slide? It's, yeah, we got the channel. Yeah. So this is what we were looking at last time, right? We were looking at agriculture, energy, minerals, and we were looking at the how concentrated these are, and each of these bars represents one country. So lithium, one country has 50% of lithium trade, and then the next country has almost 20%. So, of course, not all of these are the same importance, because some commodities are not traded as much. And this is something you can't see. For instance, wheat and rice, a lot of it is produced for internal markets. And so even if, in international trade, there are 1 or 2 countries that dominate, that doesn't mean that you couldn't change that very quickly. It's perhaps a matter of, transportation and things like that, but that's fairly substitutable. Versus something like cobalt, which, that to find cobalt elsewhere is perhaps a 20-year process, exploration and development, etc. Let's go to the next one. Okay, so here are some examples. Just because last time we were wondering, what are the countries that are behind these. So you can see palm oil, for instance, Indonesia has 60%, Malaysia 25%, Thailand 4%. And then soybeans, actually, so Brazil is the largest, US, Argentina. If you go further down, tobacco, rubber, rice, we have Chinese, and then corn, maize is the US, the 30%, etc. China, 23%. So all of these in the sources, I'm not reproducing all of them, but this just gives you the idea of how you can go about looking up and then producing that picture that I showed you. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Yeah, and here is the perspective of food security, food insecurity, which for advanced economies and especially which is on the very right hand side, the advanced economies for a long time have focused on food security. The entire European Union was based on the idea that the country should be self-sufficient in food. The US has a similar approach, and so the red is the domestic storage, which is high, and the blue is net imports, which are very low. And if you look at the net imports, they're not crucial. So if food imports became very expensive for the US, that would not be a big disaster. Same for Europe. But compare that to the low-income countries on the left-hand side, they import almost 40% of their food. So if you have a big increase in wheat prices, corn prices, etc., these are the countries that are very much affected by that. And if they are not able to purchase food, then they either have to look for loans from international organizations, from China, other bilateral loans, or find other ways to substitute for this. But their ability to do so tends to be very limited. You can think of the fact that most countries are small, but most low-income countries are small, so they don't have the capacity to develop food production very easily. Okay, so unless there are other thoughts about how we're doing time-wise.
Yes, Howard.
25 minutes.
Okay, so let's take a look at migration. And give me a warning if you would, about 10 minutes before. Yeah, I'm using very much the World Development Report. I like very much the framework that they lay out. They're saying migration, we should think of migration really in terms of 4 different areas. And some of these migrants can be a very good match, and others are less good matches or weak matches. So if we look at the top left-hand side, the many economic migrants, examples of those will be, for example, Indian engineers working in Silicon Valley. Good match. But also Bangladeshi workers working in the United Arab Emirates. Excellent match, in both cases, either directly invited or facilitated through various policies. But also a third category is put here, namely an undocumented Albanian migrant caring for an elderly person in Italy. So also a good match because people need elder care. Having someone from your own cultural area is a good match. The top right, so there's a distinction made between migrants and refugees. So the right-hand side up there, refugees with skills in demand at destination. So one example here is somebody from Syria, a Syrian entrepreneur who is a refugee in Turkey. Can be very productive. Again, kind of similar cultural background. Can be a very good match. Compare that with the lower two quadrants. On the lower right-hand side, refugees who are forcibly displaced, for example, Rohingya from Myanmar, and who may be allowed to work in Bangladesh, but it's not a great match. Bangladesh already has huge unemployment issues. And the lower left-hand side is distressed migrants. So, for example, some poorly skilled migrants at the US southern border would fit into this category. Not a great match, but there. And you see at the bottom the motive, opportunity, and destination. And on the right-hand side, the motivation is fear at home. So you see, flee from your home. Okay, next slide. So altogether, there are approximately 200 million migrants, of whom 40 million are refugees. They constitute about 2% of the global population and live in countries in all income groups. You take the next slide. So here is the foreign-born share of population by country income group. And you can see that between 1960, 90, and 2020, huge changes are in the high-income countries, where something close to 15% of the population are now foreign-born. But of course, that's a big mix of people. Probably some of you here, certainly I'm in that group. Whereas in the low-income, middle-income countries, relative to the population, the changes are much less. But that has a lot to do with the fact that these country groups have much larger growth of population. So you can, if you have an expanding, you think of an expanding country like Bangladesh or Egypt, you can have a lot of migrants coming in and still, relatively small numbers. So they are less than 5%. Okay, next slide. North America, which includes, of course, Canada. I think this makes sense. Latin America and the Caribbean are 43%. East Asia Pacific about 21%. Europe and Central Asia 16%, and South Asia about 9%. Very small number from the Middle East and North Africa. Take the next slide. But this is how they are distributed altogether. So the high-income countries have actually fewer migrants than the low and middle-income countries, which quite surprised me, to be honest. And GCC, that's the Gulf Cooperation countries, have about 17% of migrants.
Well, it says that in the low and middle income countries, the economic migration is 28%. So that would suggest those are workers coming in who would be in the middle income.
Yes, and then 15% are refugees, whereas in the high income countries, it's only 5%. And that has, of course, a lot to do with the fact that, we'll get to that in just a second, but refugees tend to go to the neighboring countries. And like Venezuela, very few come to the US, most go to countries next door, Argentina, Brazil, etc. Okay. 3 major port transit routes. I think we're all aware of those. Okay, next. This one I also thought was really very interesting. This looks at the question of are migrants paying their taxes? Simply put, there's a bit more words up there, but that's what it is. And so the left-hand side is the contributions, if you will, in Australia by migrants and naturalized citizens relative to the native population. So all the ones that I've highlighted, and this is the case, or they're the same as in Denmark. Italy, international folks are paying a whole lot more than the locals. US, yeah, also more contributions, fiscal contributions by the foreign-born, and on average, that's also the case. Now, why might this be? Well, I mean, all kinds of different reasons. For example, if you're on a green card in this country and you don't pay your taxes, you could be kicked out. Whereas if you're a US citizen and you don't pay your taxes, you can also, face all kinds of fees and penalties, but you're certainly not going to be thrown over your country. So that's probably one big reason why, you see this mismatch. But I think it's just quite an interesting statistic. It's not true in every country. And so Finland, and I don't know what the background is, but it's certainly the case in most countries.
Does this take into account under the table kind of payments? We've got friends in Germany that pay Turkish workers or Polish workers in cash, and that's never reported.
These are payments to the government.
Okay.
Right, so this is sort of tax payments. It's fiscal contributions. So it's much more narrow.
What's reported?
So it's basically income taxes, sales taxes, and things like that. Okay, and here's another important aspect of migration. People who migrate from one country to the next, especially if they are migrating from a poorer country to a wealthier country, they will send money back home. And this is called remittances. And so in quite a few countries, remittances are a major factor for the local economy. So in Tonga, which is a tiny island that has a very small economy, and a very large number of workers who left the country, 50% of their national income is from remittances. And it turns out that remittances are very stable over time. So even as a migrant who, let's say, migrates from Algeria to France and works there and may experience some difficult times, they will try to maintain the level of remittances. So statistically speaking, it's a very stable source of income for these countries. Next slide. And then people are going back home. Worldwide, about 40%. Now you can imagine that some countries, the GCC countries in particular, so Kuwait and United Arab Emirates, etc., are very, very strict about allowing workers to come into their countries. And in some of the countries, if you don't count Saudi Arabia, something like 80% of the populations are migrants in these countries. So very important. The Palestinians, Filipinos, Bangladeshis, and some advanced economy engineers too, but in the main, that's the area, and very strictly managed visas. So there, the returning home is very, very high. In OECD countries, it's between 20 and 50%, so it's also very significant. And why is that? It also depends on the countries of origin and the evolution of these countries of origin. Of course, sometimes people will migrate to, let's say, the US or migrate to France, work there until they are ready to retire, and then they have a nice foreign exchange denominated retirement, which they will take with them, and live rather well in their countries of origin. That's a very frequent story. Plus, that's where the family is, so so that's a good match. Let's go to the next. But the US is making it very comfortable. Nobody wants to leave. So, percentage, the only people who are leaving are people like myself, the Western Europeans, plus the Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders. But that makes sense because these countries, the countries of origins, are very comparable in many ways. So it's a different decision. Whereas the other have very small, low rates of return. Africa 10%, Asia a little higher, 20%, Latin America very slow, very low. And you can understand why that may be the case, and call your bank or anyone, and they will offer to speak to you in Spanish, which is everywhere. So that adds to the comfort.
Just say something. For those of you that don't know, I just retired from teaching middle school. We have a large Guatemalan and Haitian community in Caroline County. Southern Caroline County Haitian, and then I taught in Northern Caroline County, and we have a lot of Guatemalans. And their big thing, their parents are bringing them here so that their kids can have a better life. Because I taught 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. I had Guatemalan students coming into 8th grade who had never set foot in a school before because they lived so high up in the mountains, there were no schools. And that's something I think a lot of people don't think of, that many times they just want their kids to have a chance. Mm-hmm. And so they're bringing them here because, no matter what people say, our school system is not bad.
Yeah, and I think we have a course, don't we? We have a course coming up next semester on migrants in the Eastern Shore.
In Talbot County.
And I mean, the U.S. statistics on this.
Over 60 different languages are spoken in this country.
And I have to say this, the stats are really impressive. You can really look up a lot of details. I started doing that, and then I was thinking about our course, and it's quite interesting. Let's go to the next. Oh, and the only other one is there's the gender breakdown, but I don't think it's terribly meaningful. The right-hand side are females, the left-hand side are males, but it's pretty similar. Okay, a few words about refugees. We can take the next slide.
Okay, just gonna give you a heads up, 12 minutes.
Yeah, we'll be done. I thought this was quite interesting. Just look at the top line, forget about the lower line. The most refugees come from 10 countries. I would not have guessed that. I don't know about you. If I put that on the test, you would have picked maybe 20 or 30. I would not have thought it was 10 countries. Let's go to the next slide. Here are some of them. Ukraine and Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar. So those are the countries.
Are these refugees to the U.S. or just?
No, these are refugees in general. Yeah. Okay. In fact, 10 countries host more than half of foreign refugees. The U.S. and Canada are not in that. Colombia, Peru, of course, that's Venezuela, etc. So I am not sure about the Russian Federation. I was trying to think of what
workers.
Who is
Who was
there?
racing there?
Yeah.
Who's going where?
Who was racing to Russia, right?
I was thinking of Uganda too. Or not the Vietnamese.
It would be the South Sudanese.
That's David Sloan.
So I'm not sure, but Turkey certainly has a very large refugee population, etc. Next one. Okay, and then this is sort of the end of the story. When you think about migration, we talked about the undocumented Albanian taking care of somebody in Italy. More and more countries are aging very quickly, and so think about how many people does it take to support your pension and your social security, etc. That rapid shrinking is going to be a big topic in all countries. And here we already know about the US and Europe, Australia and the other advanced economies. But here are the middle income countries. And what we see here is this would be the number of children born per woman to have to match the replacement rate. But, we're very quickly going below the replacement rate in all of these countries. And, so Brazil and Mexico, Egypt, South Africa, India, by 2050, the world population is going to start shrinking. That's been a prediction for the last 20 years, and it looks like this is exactly what's going to happen. So, this is something to keep in mind when we look at migration. People, coming into your countries, Canada has a very pro-immigration policy, realizing that if they don't, they will have huge problems in financing, a stable life and stable expectation for their aging population. For the US, this is actually much less of an issue because the US is relatively young compared to the other advanced economies. And I think that reflects the fact that it is already, a country that has a significant migrant population.
Wasn't that the reasoning a few years back that why Germany let so many
Syrians come in? Yeah, exactly. That was, when the Syrian civil war broke out, Angela Merkel invited, a lot of people from Syria. It wasn't managed very well, and could have been done better. But in any case, that was exactly the thinking. Okay. Just to, it's the same information, but China is in the same boat as everybody else, which 20 years ago was certainly not the case. But one-child policy has had very long-term effects for everyone. Okay, so this is just a brief recap of what we've been talking about. So we started out with the overall economic growth and its components, the consumption, investment, government spending, and trade. We also looked at a statistic that showed us that the cost of the pandemic was vastly different across countries, and some countries actually benefited on a net basis, even though there are huge costs associated with that. We talked a little bit about the role of China and India, some of the risks, especially in terms of fragmentation of global trade. We talked about the commodities, drivers of inflation, but also vehicles of fragmentation and political disputes. And finally, migration, refugees, and aging populations. And that completes my course.
Thank you everyone on Zoom for being so patient. We know it's hard to hear sometimes.
Yeah.